What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and today we're going to be going over the Blueprint Input Buffer System Part 2. So I'm pretty excited about this one because this one is going to be changing the inputs from hard-coded keys to specific input types. This is similar to what we did in the fighting game tutorial series. This is basically going to catch us up to the regular fighting game tutorial series input buffer that we have, minus a few things, but since this input buffer is a little bit different, and it's not necessarily meant for a fighting game, but it can be used anywhere, could be used in a fighting game, then there are a few differences and a few things that I'm going to cover. But one thing I wanted to mention is that, so now if I press Z and X, I can perform this action, but I perform this action based off my project settings, not because my actual inputs are Z and X. So I have a few different things I'm trying to put together here. So people ask me to do the fighting game blueprint, or fighting game input buffer in Blueprint. That's what we're covering. But I've also got requests to basically make an input buffer system that is dynamic in size, which technically it is. We haven't added or removed anything at the moment, and that's something we can cover in the next episode. But using commands and using types like this will definitely make it a lot more dynamic because we don't have to add it on the spot. It can be added whenever we collide with something. And this will also cover another thing that I'm looking into, or another thing that I'm going to be covering in this series, which is being able to determine, where we should stop based on what is around us. So for example, we have different inputs we can press based on either what we're colliding with, like if we're close enough to some sort of collider to pick up an item, or attack an enemy, or perform a spell, something like that. And the last thing that I want to cover that's related to this would be changing events. Changing these by events, so we can add or remove inputs, update the inputs by event. So all those will be covered probably in the next episode, but they stem from this episode. So this episode is basically catching us up to the fighting game tutorial series input buffer, but strictly in Blueprint. And there's other things we will do with it from here. So just everybody who's been asking me questions about it, don't worry, we are going to get to all of them. But I did want to wrap this up first before we got into other stuff, because first of all, it makes sense since we started the first episode by doing the fighting game tutorial input buffer in Blueprint, and also because that input buffer, in my opinion, is very, very nice. I like it a lot, and we can use it now that it's not hard-coded keys, to be able to alter a lot of our things and make it better. So let's just get right into it today without wasting any time. It's Blueprint only, so obviously there's no code, but if you do want to catch up on all the Blueprint stuff that we did in the last episode, I'll leave a link in this icon in the top right corner right here, and you can see how I made the first episode and all the logic before this. Otherwise, I will leave a link to the fighting game tutorial series input buffer. It's a mix of code and Blueprint, but if you want to check out how I did it there, or everything that we can do now, that's a good place to start. Alright, and then other than that, we'll just go ahead and get started. There's not much to do today outside of the base character BP, or whatever your character happens to be called, because basically we're going to be going over the functions that they have, that the character has, and we're going to be updating it to work off of this type. And what I mean by type is, we were using Z and X before, so let's take a look at this. So we had our input buffer, right? And our input buffer had nothing in it originally because that's what gets added to when we press keys. But we had the command list, which means when we press certain buttons, then we could fire commands. But now I've changed the inputs to be enums, so we can use these enums instead to be able to trigger them. Now this is good for a few reasons. It's good because you don't need a specific key, so say I set this up, special move 1, special move 2. Well, I would have to either set up keys for the controller and the keyboard or whatever other device I was using, or I could just set it up like this, where it's an enum, and bind in the project settings these values to this enum. Basically, I can either access it by pressing Z on the keyboard, Z and X on the keyboard, or A and B on the controller, something like that. So it's good for that. It's also good because any player can access it. If you have multiple players on one device, like a keyboard, then you don't need to look for a specific key. It can be, different. Any player, every player can access this as long as they have access to those two inputs. And also, it's just more convenient for different situations. If I'm facing one direction and I want to perform an action without turning around, then maybe I don't want to press all these other keys or these other inputs to perform this action. So if it's not specific inputs, again, we can just tie them to action mappings and be good to go. So there's a lot of things here, a lot of reasons this is good. But to make this happen, we need to basically, change the strings that we had to work with these enums. There's a few different ways we have to do this. So first of all, I'm going to go into my blueprints folder, logic, and then go into input type. And then I'll show you how to make this in a second. So I've made a blueprint enum, and this is what has all my values that I was just showing you. Special move 1, special move 2 is for my first command, and I think my other one is forward, special move, something like that. But there you go. You can see I've made all my values here. So to make an enum in blueprint, you just go add new, blueprints, enumeration. Now once you've done that, you'll get this file here. And you can hit new as many times as you want. And basically, you're going to want to fill out all your action and axis mappings. I actually have not filled them all out, simply because I did not want to do axis mappings in this episode. There is a reason for that. So we'll do it in the next episode. And this is mainly because I actually want to change these values based on certain things to determine what direction we're going. And it's a little bit more complex, so for right now, I feel like we'll just do the action mappings. But I still added them all, and we can just set them later. So I just did forward, backward, left, and right. That way we know what direction we're moving. And then I have my different actions I can perform right now, which are jump, attack. And then I had two buttons that I made. I called them Special Move 1 and Special Move 2, which didn't actually do anything prior. But these are basically just alternate buttons that I can use, right? So maybe one of them does something special on its own, but they both perform a combo. You can use whatever buttons you want. You could use attack twice to perform this command. It really doesn't matter. I was just using an example. As long as they're tied to action mappings, you were good. So let me show you how to set that up really quickly. Edit, project settings, input. Now I have all these expanded, but you can see these are the ones that are in here already. I've changed punch to basic attack, and I created two new ones. To add a new one, you just go up to the top, adds action mapping, and you can say add special action 1, special action 2. So whatever that may be, whether it's interact or something else. Okay, so these names don't have to line up perfectly. This is just for you to know kind of what the relationship will be. You can call them the exact same thing if you want. Okay? And now, one other thing, in the F command info and the F input info, these are two structures we made in episode 1, which is, we were comparing strings of the keys we were pressing. Well, we're going to switch the string to our new enum, which I called E input type. It's right here. So go ahead and change those. You can keep it called, I was calling them inputs, an input name. You can keep those the same. We don't need to change the names or anything, but just change the type and you're good to go. You can keep this one as a regular input type, and you can keep the command info as an array of input types. And close all these now. Okay, now when you look at your input buffer, it will be a little bit different. These will probably be the default value now since you changed it, so you may need to compile your blueprint to make sure that everything changed. And then go ahead and set your values again for what you want. We're going to go over setting these up, of course, but just set them to be whatever you expect. Like, if you had it as Z and X, and those are now Special Move 1 and Special Move 2, then guess what? That's what I want to do. I want to use Special Move 1 and Special Move 2 to use this command. One more thing we need before we can get started on the actual logic in the graph. We're going to need an input to input type map. The way you make this is you make a new variable. I'm going to actually do this with you because the map is a little bit confusing. Then you click on this where you would normally go to change the type of variable. And you can actually make it a map. Now you do need to make it a certain type, like some won't work, like a boolean. I believe you can do it with anything else. And then you want map. And then map has two types, okay? Once you get here, I'm going to delete this now and I'll just show you the other one. Then you want to put string on the left and your enum on the right. And this is basically because we're going to bind the key to the enum value. So in a nutshell, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the project settings one more time. And what we'll end up doing is this. We'll actually be taking the value in here, Z or X in this case, and if you have multiple, they will also come with it. So this is why it'll work on keyboard and controller. It'll basically bind these to that value. So you can have Z is bound to special action 1, but also X on the controller is. And then whenever that key is pressed, we will check the input type of that key. And then say, oh, that's special action 1. So then we'll know at this point that we have used what I believe I called special move 1. And that's how we can check against our command list. So this is a lot of setup, but now we're good to actually do the work in the graph. So hopefully that all makes sense. Let's go into base character BP, and we'll start working on this. So first things first, we do need to make a few changes to our add input to input buffer. And it might not make a lot of sense yet since we haven't added anything to the input type map. But since this is code we already have, I'm just going to show you again. So add input to input buffer is what we were calling whenever we were pressing a button, we were adding input to input buffer, right? Add input to buffer, sorry. Add input to buffer. So add input to buffer, basically every time we were pressing any sort of button, then this event was getting called, and then it was eventually calling add input to input buffer. And that's a little bit confusing. The input action is any key. It will pick up on any single key that we press here. So that's what's going on here. Then add input to input buffer is where we actually add the key to the input buffer array if it's a valid input, basically. So this stuff here is all good. I did not change any of it. Since we did change our input buffer variable, since we changed the E input, then you may need to refresh this or refresh the break. You just right click and hit refresh nodes. The rest you can leave the same. And on completed is pretty much the same, but we are going to change it a little bit. So we were doing get key display name right here, so we could get the name of it and plug it into the parameter here. But now we're going to do it a little bit differently. We don't want the key name anymore for the input buffer. We want the enum type. But we will put the inputs in this map. So the way you access things in a map, you grab the map, get find, and then give it the key. Once you give it the key, you can find the value, or once you give it the value, you can find the key, depending on which way you're doing it. So in this case, we're still going to get key display name off of the key that was pressed by add input to buffer. And then you don't have to do this conversion manually. This is a text to string conversion. It will do it automatically if you do this. So bring your map on and just type find and then drag it in. It will automatically convert for you. Alright, and this is going to return an enum and a boolean. It's basically going to return if the item was found or not, and then if it was, it's going to return the enum. We want the enum for our add input to input buffer. So add input to input buffer, it needs to be an f input info, which it should have been already, which means this would have been a string. So you may need to refresh this node as well, just to make sure we're up to date. And once you're good, just drag the enum into the enum slot, and you can still use get time seconds for the float. So the only thing that's changed here, really the only thing, are these updated automatically when we updated f input info, so you may need to refresh them. And also this map, before we were just using the get key display name and passing that in, now we're doing this instead. So it's not too bad, but just something we have to think about. Alright, and now I've set up a few functions. We're not going to actually use all of them today, but it is important that we set them up. So let's go ahead and set them all up now. We already had these other ones in here. I set up, I made two new functions, one called setup input actions, one called setup input axes. So setup input actions we will be covering right now, but setup input axes I did not do anything in. This is what I was referring to when, the input axis in the project settings, how I said we won't be covering them yet because they're a little bit more advanced with some things we want to do. So I did set it up because I want to call it in a certain spot today, but I haven't done anything here. So go ahead and make two functions. You can call them this if you want or whatever. Basically just know one is for just buttons and presses and the other one is for the axes, which has, the value associated with it. It's like a joystick, a thumbstick, anything like that. So we don't need this right now. Let me organize this a little bit. Alright, so let's go over just everything that we have so far. I won't go over it in depth, but just to make sure that we haven't missed anything. So for add input to input buffer, which gets called right here, then we don't have to change anything. This is an f input info, so again, some of the values will have changed internally, but we're not using any of them here, so it should be fine. Feel free to refresh these if they're giving you errors. Then we call check input buffer for command. Let's go to that one. Now check input buffer for command will take a little bit of changes, but really, again, it's the same function. We just have to change what we're doing in it. We don't want to use the string anymore. So f command info had a string array called inputs. And now, since we changed the f command info to have the enum, an array of enums, then this is different. Of course, with the for loop then, it's not a for loop of strings, it's a for loop of enums. So let's go over everything that got changed here. So you may need to refresh this, just as usual. Every time you change something within a structure, you'll probably have to refresh or it'll give you errors. And I disconnected the for each loop and passed the enum back into it. If it doesn't let you, sometimes for loops are a little bit finicky with that. Just make a new for loop and then just pass it into it. That'll work. And you can just delete the old one if it doesn't work. Alright, so that's step one. We have to replace this for loop. And then we have to replace the areas where these items are being used. So this was a string before. This was going to compare the key to the key. Now it's an enum type. So we're going to bring it here. And at the very end here, not at the very end, but toward the end here, we were doing input info get with this index, and we were comparing it to the input info name of the input buffer at that index. Okay, so we were comparing the name at the index to the name of the index from the for loop, right? We're comparing two to make sure that they were the same input. That way we knew if it was a correct value in the command or not. Well, we're doing the same thing here. It's literally the same thing. It's just now the input name is this enum. Again, refresh this if needed. So it's not a string. So instead of doing the string compare, you can get rid of any string compare stuff here. Drag off of your input name, type equal equal, and we'll say equal enum. Select that, and then drag in for your other option the array element off the for loop. And then it still goes to the branch as usual. So make sure you drag that into the branch. And the rest of the stuff over here is exactly the same as it was, so you don't have to change anything with it. Now the only other difference in here is, again, the string array was being brought down here, so instead bring the inputs array down here and get length. Technically it wouldn't matter if you kept this a string array, since length will work with any array, but the problem is if you actually left it as it was, it'll probably fail because Unreal sees this as a different type of array, a different variable you're putting into it now. So you have to make sure you do disconnect it and then reconnect it with the new one. Otherwise it'll complain at you. And then we call start command if a command was found. So check input buffer for command is good. Let's go into start command. Now start command, we don't actually use anything with the new logic, with the inputs array. So there's no reason to change anything in here. Just refresh this node if necessary to make sure you're not getting an error. And you can go ahead and leave this alone. You can also get rid of this print string now if you want. I was just using it for debugging purposes. Okay, and then we need setup input actions. Now, setup input actions is not going to fire after those. It's actually going to be fired on begin play. So if I go to my event graph, I made event begin play. You can just look event begin play up, and it will be here. You don't have to create it. It's one that Unreal has, like it's called when the object is constructed. And we're going to call this function that we made, setup input actions. And we're doing that because setup input actions needs to be done right away so that we know the conversions from key to the actual input in the game. All right, and in this function, what we need to do, this is where we're going to convert the buttons to the enums. So if you've seen the fighting game tutorial series, you should actually be very familiar with this process, but we're going to cover it in depth anyway. So just follow my lead here. We're going to get input settings. Literally get input settings, just like that. We're going to drag off of this and type get action names. All right. That returns this node, which has an array. The action names are the action mapping names. So if I look at this one more time, then you can see it's jump, reset VR, sprint, heal, damage, equip, zoom, basic attack, open close menu, add input the buffer, special action 1, special action 2. Okay? So that's what these action names are. We're going to loop through them. This is an array, so just drag off and do for each loop. And then off of the input settings, you can search for get action mapping by name. See that? It's going to require an action name. Well, since we're going to loop through them all, we're just going to loop them all and we're going to look for certain keywords. Since we set up the names of the action mappings in the project settings, we know what keywords to look for. So this is a perfectly safe method to use. So basically just loop through all of them. Okay, drag an array element to an action name. And then we're going to loop through the out mappings. The mappings that get put out are the keys, so like Z, X, but also if I put controller values under these inputs, they'll be important as well. So if I want to put joystick or A on an Xbox controller, then all these will come out to this loop. This is important because we do want to bind all of them. You know, if there's multiple inputs for a certain action mapping, we want all of them to be included. So we want to loop through this one as well. So you can just drag off for each loop yet again. Then we want to get the data from this input action key mapping structure because we want to compare the names. So we can drag off of the array element and type break and break it. You'll see it here. You may need to use the arrow to expand it, depending. And all we really care about here are the name and the key. So we can drag off of both of them and do a few different things. First of all, do a contains string node. So contains and the one that says string. And then now what we're going to do, I know this looks like a lot, this is actually the same process for the next 4 keys that I use. Basically for every action mapping you have that you want to bind to an enum value as opposed to the key, the specific hard-coded key, you're going to search for either the exact name of your action mapping or something specific enough that it won't pick up on other action mappings by mistake. So for example, sorry, not search in. So the substring that you're searching for in my action mappings, like jump, basic attack, special action 1, special action 2, as specific as it has to be separate from the others. So that's what you're going to type in here. So like jump. Okay? And then for what you're searching in, you're going to bring in the action name. It will automatically do this conversion for you. Then it returns if it was found or not. So if this string was found within this action name. So if jump was found. If it is, so branch, then we can add it to the input map. Okay? I'll show you how to do that in a second. If it's not, we're going to continue to the next option. We don't have to continue if it's true because we know that, you know, hopefully the goal is that these are specific enough that it will only ever go to 1. So if it matched jump, it shouldn't match any of the others. Alright? So let's go to add to input map. Go to your event graph. Go down to the bottom. You can right click, add custom event, right here. Click on the event, and then you can add 2 input parameters, a string and an e input type. We're basically adding the same thing that our e or input to input type map has, a string and an E input type. And the reason we're doing this is just because we're going to add these values to our map. We have never done anything with the map yet, so we have to add values to it. So we have input and type, like I said here, and it's really simple. To add it to a map, you just get your map, add, and then you pass in the values. So connect your white line, and then connect your input and your enum, and it will add, for that string, for that key, it will add this enum value. So whenever we press that key, it knows that we're pressing that enum. Okay, so basically we're just going to do that for every case here. So we have add to input map, which we just made. That's what we made right here. And we're passing in the input name. So let me show you. Off the key, we have get key display name right here. And then we're just going to pass that into the string here. It will automatically do this conversion for you. So your get key display name is the input. That's how we know what button, what input ties to this value. And then the type is the type that we choose. So if it's jump, then here's the input, and the type we want is E jump. If it's not jump, false, then we go to the next branch, and we check for basic attack in these action mappings. If that is found, if it's true, then the type is E attack. See, and I use my key display name still. This is all the key display name on the bottom. This top is the action mapping name. Then, if it's false, we check for special attack 1. Do the same thing. Then, if it is, we add to the input map this input at E special move 1. Lastly, if it's false, but we have special action 2, then we go ahead and pass in the input and set it to E special move 2. Remember, we're making the association between the input that the player presses and the actual value that we care about, the enum value that we care about, so we know what action is being performed. And I just left these here so we could continue as we add more action mappings. We will add more axis mappings in the future, but the last thing I wanted to say is at the very first for loop here, once it's completed, so once we've gone through all the action mappings, you can call setup input axes, and we won't do anything with that, but we'll be ready to work on that in the next episode. Alright guys, so thank you so much for watching. That's all I've got for you today. If this helped you make your blueprint input buffer system, please subscribe. It does more for me in the channel than anything else you can do, and I just really appreciate it. I want to give a huge shout out to my YouTube membership and Patreon supporters and subscribers. Thank you guys so much for continuing to believe in me and give me all this support. I really, really appreciate it, and again, it helps me continue making these videos, and I really love making them, so thank you. If you had any issues with this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community, and feel free to join us every Friday, 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for some Twitch live streams. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.